Embassy of the Dead, Chapter 27, Zorro. I have witnessed a murder, Jake thought. He shook his head. I have witnessed a murder that happened a long time ago. He didn't know which was more shocking, the fact of the murder or the fact that he'd witnessed something that had happened before he had even been born. He was just processing that thought when a shadow flitted across the kitchen. Jake scrambled to his feet. Is there anybody there? He reached into his pocket for his phone and switched on the torch. No one special, boy, came Stiffkey's voice from the shadows. He stepped into the light. It's darker than my grave down here, he said, brushing some dirt from the rim of his hat and placing it back on his head. Why would you do that? Said Jake, struggling for breath. You scared me half to death. You could have warned me. Stiffkey brushed some more dirt from his waistcoat. When you walk through walls, there ain't no telling where you're going to end up. Where's Cora? Asked Jake. Well, she was being impertinent again, so I left her trophy in the van, and luckily she can't reach as far as the house. I left her complaining just the other side of the hedge, said Stiffkey. That's a bit mean, said Jake, smirking. Stiffkey removed his hat and inspected it for nothing in particular. Anyway, boy, I come with news of Rose Bahari. Murdered, I know, finished Jake. That ain't what I was going to say. Stiffkey's eyes narrowed. How do you know she were murdered? I think I had, started Jake, embarrassed to finish his sentence. I had a vision. I saw it. I saw someone push Rose down the stairs. We need to find her murderer so she can be undone. Stiffkey's face looked grave indeed. Well, boy, seems you do have those ghostly ways, whether you like it or not. Best keep that kind of thing to yourself, mind. It's known in our world as farsight, and farsight's old magic. His brow furrowed. And, as you know, old magic is forbidden, and rightly so. Jake nodded. It seemed better to agree, and he had no idea if the vision was real. Maybe he'd hallucinated through lack of sleep, or if it would happen again. What were you going to say? Asked Jake. If it wasn't that she was murdered. It's worse than murder, boy. Well, for us anyway. Rose Bahari's already been undone. Stiffkey redirected Jake's phone torch around the room, and there, on the wall above a rusty old sink, scrawled in red spray paint, was the symbol of the Embassy of the Dead and the initials ES. Edward Stapleton, said Stiffkey. He's an undoer I used to know. Not sure if he's still in the business, but it seems he's undone this ghost at some point in time. The mark's carved onto the garden gate too. Not sure how we missed it. So what do we do now? Asked Jake, staring at the mark and feeling panic rise. Edward Stapleton might as well have written, Jake Green is going to get sent to the eternal void. He didn't want to think about what this meant, but it was time to face up to things. Time to turn themselves into the embassy. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope that the embassy would help and protect them from Mawkins once the finger was safe. Jake shone his torch around the kitchen again, looking for a quick way out. The sooner they left this house, the better. His eyes settled on the front door. He tried the handle, even though he knew it was padlocked from the outside. A large flap had been cut in the bottom of the door, like a homemade cat flap, but bigger, although too small for Jake to crawl through. On the floor next to the door was a ceramic bowl. A single word surrounded with hand-painted flowers read, Zorro. The word was familiar from his Spanish lessons. What was it again? El gato negro, the black cat. El ratón blanco, the white mouse. El zorro rojo, the red fox. That's it, Zorro means fox. Jake thought back to the little creature that had been watching him from the front garden. Then something made him look up. It was the sense of something, a sadness, a ghost. Something's here, said Jake. I think the embassy missed something. He shivered. It was cold. like when he was in the assembly hall looking for Cora. He crouched down, pushed open the flap in the door and peered through. There, on the lawn, just outside the door, sat the fox. It was staring sadly at Rose Bahari's house. Zorro, the ghost fox. Jake smiled as everything clicked into place. Zorro had been Rose's pet, a tame fox, and he'd witnessed the murder. He'd seen Rose fall. It was through his eyes that Jake had seen Rose's death. He looked back at Stiffkey and said, "Can we undo a fox?" Stiffkey looked a little bemused until Jake pointed to the lonely-looking ghost animal in Rose's back garden. Stiffkey shook his head. "I don't know about that. Truth be told, I don't know anyone who ever tried. You certainly wouldn't get an undoer's licence for it. Ain't you content meddling in the affairs of the human dead? Got to start meddling in the affairs of vermin too?" Zorro still sat in the field, gazing at the house with sorrowful eyes. "Can't we help him at all? He seems so sad," said Jake, beckoning for the fox to come over. Warily, the fox trotted towards them, nervously stepping through the flap and sniffing at Jake's fingers. Its muzzle disappeared through his hand. The fox jumped back in confusion. Stiffkey lifted his top hat and scratched his forehead. "I've known a fair few animal ghosts, usually dogs or ravens, the cleverer of the beasts. The others don't feel enough and just pass on simply." He pulled a face. "Never seen a ghost cat, that's for sure." A look of disapproval crossed his face. "Naturally self-centred creatures, cats. Wouldn't catch a cat mourning the body of its owner. Most likely eat the poor soul." "But surely we can undo this one if he's trapped and suffering," said Jake. "Well, the problems that trap animal ghosts on the earthly plane are simpler, but it's the simple problems that are the hardest to undo. Take this fox, for example. Died of a broken heart, most likely. And the only way to fix that is to bring Rose Bahari back, which is impossible. So our young fox is going to have to wait till his energies all fade away, just like old Stiffkey here." He crouched down next to Jake, who was scratching the little ghost fox behind his ear, and gave the sad animal a pet too. "Now come on, boy." He looked at Jake from under his heavy grey eyebrows, his expression laden with sorrow. "We need to get to the embassy. It's time to face the music." Jake smiled weakly and stood up. He knew it was the right thing to do. "Let's hope the music isn't a funeral march," he said, bending to give the fox a last pet goodbye. Stiffkey and Jake walked back to the van in silence. So far it had all felt unreal, almost fun at times. A crazy adventure. Severed fingers, ghosts, reapers. Jake could hardly believe it all himself, even after everything he'd been through. But now, with every step, he felt a deep fear starting to take hold. And he knew he had to call Mum and Dad soon. But what would he say? How could they possibly understand what had happened to him? How could anybody? All he could do would be to say goodbye. He glanced down at the phone in his hand and started tapping a group message to Mum and Dad. "Hi, Mum and Dad. I just needed to say..." He paused. He wanted to write, "I just needed to say, thanks for everything you've done for me. I love you." But he couldn't. Something stopped him, something inside him that made it almost impossible to put his feelings down in words. His mind wandered to that day when Dad had left. Jake put the phone back in his pocket. A rustling sound behind him made Jake turn round. It was the fox. It was padding behind them as they made their way back across the garden. Jake crouched down and held out his hand. "It's all right, boy," he said. "You'll be okay." Jake scratched it comfortingly behind the ear. "I'm sure you won't be waiting for too much longer." But it hurt Jake to leave the little creature there all alone. He turned to look up at Stiffkey, his eyes wide and pleading. The old ghost stared back sternly. "Don't even think about it, boy." He shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. Don't we have enough troubles?" 5 minutes later, one grumpy spectre, a furious possessor, a grinning boy, and a very happy ghost fox were all piled into the camper van, making their way to whatever fate might greet them at the Embassy of the Dead. In the back, on the folded down bed, lay Stifky, his legs fading through the closed door of the camper van, his top hat resting on his chest. "I'll be needing to close my eyes," said the ghost. "If you follow the directions I gave you, we shall be there in an hour or two. Please be alerting me when we arrive." Jake nodded. Even ghosts needed to rest, it seemed. Not to sleep exactly, just to take some time to allow their minds to still and their energies to gather. And Stifky needed to be strong to face the embassy. Jake could see the worry on the old ghost's face at the thought of returning to the embassy in disgrace, the rule breaker, and facing judgment for interfering in the embassy's business. Cora sat in the front with Jake, the happy ghost fox on her lap, while Jake chewed gratefully on the cheese sandwich he'd remembered was in his rucksack. It wasn't bad considering it was 2 days old. He was glad his passengers were all ghosts and he didn't have to share it, as, along with a Twix and a packet of crisps that made up his packed lunch, it was the only thing he'd eaten since tea with Dad. He shook his head at the thought of what his mum would say. No vegetables. Jake smiled sadly. What he wouldn't give now for one of his dad's fried breakfasts. "Would your dad be angry if he knew you had his van?" said Cora, as if reading his thoughts. Jake imagined his dad's reaction. Not angry, upset. He's not really the angry type. "What are yours like?" Cora stared ahead. "I don't like my parents," she said bluntly. She turned to Jake and raised an eyebrow at him, like she was challenging him to say something back. He didn't. He wanted to. He wanted to ask her more about her life and her parents, but instead he changed the subject. "It's getting colder, isn't it?" he said, embarrassed at his own awkwardness. "Yeah, it's the fog," said Cora, peering out of the window. "What is it with this fog anyway? It was sunny just a second ago." Jake's blood ran cold. First the fog. Stifky sat up straight, fresh dirt falling from his shoulders. "Fog, you say? I ain't keen on fog. Hides all manner of things." Cora pointed out the front windscreen. "Like those two massive dogs." Jake pulled the wheel hard to the left, bumping onto a side track that ran behind a line of trees parallel to the road. He braked suddenly as the track faded into woodland. The engine stalled and cut out. "It's a dead end." He peered through the fog and saw more creatures approaching. Cora frowned. "Those aren't dogs." "Bone Wolf!" shouted Jake, desperately trying to start Pickle. Nothing. Stifky's head appeared by his side. "Drive, boy, drive!" Jake tried again. Still nothing. "Come on!" cried Jake in desperation as he turned the key in the ignition once more, but Pickle resolutely refused to start. He closed his eyes in frustration, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, then opened his eyes, ready to try again. He immediately wished he hadn't. 20 yards ahead of them, illuminated in the full beam of the van's headlights and flanked by 2 more slavering Bone Wolf, stood a tall, hooded figure, his arm outstretched, his finger pointing at Jake. Stifky's voice broke the silence. "Mawkins," he whispered. Wow, there we go. Mawkins has come.
They're in trouble.
They're in trouble.